The dusty street of Redemption Springs shimmered under the merciless Arizona sun as Gemma Blackwell stood trembling at the altar of the town's only church, her wedding dress billowing in the hot breeze of 1885. The ceremony had come to an abrupt halt when her groom, Harold Whitcomb, had failed to appear, leaving her abandoned before God and the entire settlement of 200 souls. "I cannot bear this shame," Gemma whispered, her gloved hands clutching a bouquet of wilting desert flowers as the murmurs of the townspeople grew louder behind her. Sheriff Thomas Jarrett watched from the back of the church, his weathered face impassive beneath his Stetson. At 30 years old, he'd seen his share of heartbreak in these parts, but something about the quiet dignity of this woman as she faced humiliation stirred something inside him. He'd only been in Redemption Springs for 8 months, having taken the badge after the previous sheriff was gunned down by cattle rustlers, but in that time he'd developed a reputation as a fair but unyielding lawman. "Miss Blackwell," Reverend Phillips said gently, placing a hand on her arm. "Perhaps we should adjourn." "No," Gemma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I will walk out with my head high." She turned to face the congregation, many of whom averted their eyes in second-hand embarrassment. "Thank you all for coming. It appears there will be no wedding today." Thomas watched as she walked down the aisle, her steps measured and careful. But he saw what others missed: the slight quiver of her chin, the tension in her shoulders, the way she blinked rapidly to hold back the flood of tears that threatened to spill. As she passed him at the church door, heading into the blinding sunlight, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Miss Blackwell," he said, catching up to her on the church steps, "allow me to escort you home." She stiffened, not looking at him. "I require no escort, Sheriff. I have been humiliated quite enough for one day." "The sun's mighty fierce," he persisted, falling into step beside her. "And I reckon the vultures of this town are fiercer still with their gossip. Better to have a badge beside you." They walked in silence past the general store where Mrs. Perkins and her daughter openly stared, past the saloon where even the midday drinkers had emptied onto the boardwalk to witness her shame. "Harold left a note," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "Reverend Phillips gave it to me just before the ceremony. He's gone to California, found gold fever more appealing than a wife." Thomas's jaw tightened. "A man who leaves a woman like you at the altar isn't worth the paper he wrote his cowardly words on." When they reached the small but tidy house at the edge of town where Gemma lived alone since her father's passing last winter, she finally turned to face him. The tears she had been fighting were now visible, trembling on her eyelashes. "Thank you for the escort, Sheriff," she said formally, trying to hide the tears with a downturned face. Thomas Jarrett surprised himself then. He reached out, his calloused finger gently lifting her chin. "Your tears will be wiped away by me," he said softly, "if you'll allow it." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something neither had expected on this day that was supposed to be the beginning of a different life for Gemma. "Why would you say such a thing?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Because I've watched you teach those children at the schoolhouse with patience and kindness. I've seen you help Widow Johnson with her garden when your own needed tending. You deserve better than tears on what should have been your happiest day." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to her. "I don't need pity, Sheriff Jarrett," she said, although she took the handkerchief. "It's not pity I'm offering, Miss Blackwell." His eyes held hers steadily. "It's respect." With that, he tipped his hat and turned to leave. He had barely taken 3 steps when her voice stopped him. "Sheriff, would you like to come in for some coffee? It seems I have a wedding feast with no wedding, and it would be a shame to let Mrs. Hoffman's cake go to waste." Thomas turned, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'd be honored, madam." That afternoon marked the beginning. They sat at her small kitchen table, drinking coffee and eating wedding cake, talking about everything except the ceremony that hadn't happened. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his years driving cattle before he pinned on a badge. She spoke of her dreams of expanding the schoolhouse, of the books she ordered from back east to share with her pupils. As the sun began to set, Thomas finally stood to leave. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Blackwell. Gemma," she said. "I think after sharing my wedding cake you might call me Gemma." "Gemma," he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue, "and I'm Thomas or Tom to most folks." "Thank you, Thomas," she said, walking him to the door. "You've made an unbearable day." "Bearable," he nodded, suddenly awkward now that their unexpected time together was ending. "Perhaps I could call on you properly sometime, Sunday after church, maybe." The faintest blush colored her cheeks. "I would like that." True to his word, Thomas called on Gemma the following Sunday. They walked along the creek that ran behind the town, talking easily despite the curious glances from townspeople they passed. By the next Sunday, it had become an expected thing, the sheriff and the schoolteacher, walking together after church. Spring moved into summer, and their Sunday walks became daily visits. Thomas would stop by the schoolhouse after the children had gone, ostensibly to ensure her safe passage home, though everyone in town knew the schoolhouse was just 300 yards from her front door. On a particularly hot August evening, they sat on her porch, drinking lemonade as the sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. "You never speak of him," Thomas said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Whitcomb, I mean." Gemma's hands stilled on her glass. "What is there to say?" "He didn't want me enough to stay." "He was a fool," Thomas said, his voice low and intense. "If you were mine, wild horses couldn't drag me from your side." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken feelings. "Is that so, Sheriff?" she asked softly. "That's so, Miss Blackwell." He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand in his. "I find myself thinking of you at all hours, when I'm making my rounds, when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm eating my solitary meals." Her breath caught. "Thomas," the moment was shattered by the sound of gunshots from the direction of the saloon. Thomas was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. "Stay here," he commanded, already moving down the steps. "Be careful." She called after him, her heart suddenly pounding with fear for him rather than the lingering embarrassment of her failed wedding. That night changed things between them. The gunfight at the saloon, a drunken dispute over a card game, had left one man dead and Thomas with a bullet graze across his arm. When he finally returned to Gemma's house after the doctor had patched him up, she flew off the porch and into his arms, propriety forgotten. "I thought." "When I heard more shots." She couldn't finish the sentence, her face buried against his chest. "I'm here," he said, his good arm tightening around her. "I'll always come back to you, Gemma." 2 weeks later, as summer gave way to the first hints of autumn, Thomas proposed. Not with flowery words or grand gestures, but with simple honesty as they stood beside the creek where they'd had their first walk. "I love you, Gemma Blackwell. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you standing in that church, refusing to break. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd fought on that abandoned wedding day. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Jarrett." They planned a simple ceremony for October, when the desert heat would have relented enough for comfort. This time, there would be no elaborate preparations, no fancy dress ordered from San Francisco. Just two people who had found each other when they least expected it. The day before the wedding, disaster struck. A gang of outlaws, the notorious Slater brothers who had been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory, rode into Redemption Springs just before noon. Thomas, along with his deputy, confronted them as they attempted to rob the bank. Gemma was in the schoolhouse when she heard the gunfire. Her first instinct was to ensure the safety of her students, barricading the door and keeping the children away from windows. But her heart was outside with Thomas. The shootout lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to Gemma. When silence finally fell, she instructed the oldest boy to keep the others inside and slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse. The scene that greeted her in the main street was chaotic. 2 bodies lay in the dust, both wearing the rough clothes of outlaws. Deputy Wilson sat on the boardwalk, clutching his bleeding leg, and Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" she asked Wilson, fear making her voice sharp. "Where is the sheriff? They took him," Wilson gasped through his pain. "Two of them escaped, took the sheriff as a hostage." Rode north. Gemma's world tilted. Tomorrow was to be her wedding day, and now Thomas was in the hands of murderous outlaws. The men of the town quickly organized a posse, but Gemma knew they would be hours in gathering. She made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her as the proper schoolteacher. She went home, changed into her most practical clothes, a riding skirt and sturdy blouse, and took her father's old Winchester rifle from above the fireplace. Then she saddled her horse, a reliable mare named Penny, and set out north, following the tracks the outlaws had left in their haste. She had grown up in this territory, had learned tracking from her father, who had been a scout for the army before settling down to ranch. If anyone could find Thomas quickly, it was her. The trail led into the foothills, becoming harder to follow as the ground grew rockier. But Gemma persisted, pushing Penny as fast as she dared on the treacherous terrain. As the sun began to set, she spotted smoke from a campfire in a small canyon ahead. Moving cautiously now, she tied Penny to a scrub oak and continued on foot, the Winchester clutched tightly in her hands. As she crept closer, she could hear voices, rough, angry voices, and then a third voice that made her heart leap. "Thomas, alive. You won't get far," he was saying, his tone remarkably calm for a man whose hands were bound to a pine tree. "Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you now." "Shut up," growled one of the outlaws, a bearded man with a livid scar across his forehead. "We should have killed you back in town. And hang for sure. This way we got leverage," said the second outlaw, younger and nervous-looking. "We can trade him for safe passage to Mexico." Gemma's mind raced. Two armed men against one woman with a rifle she hadn't fired in years. The odds weren't good, but she couldn't wait for the posse that might be hours behind her. She thought of her students, of how she taught them that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Taking a deep breath, she moved into position behind a boulder that gave her a clear shot into the camp. She aimed carefully at a pot hanging over the campfire and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, startling both outlaws and sending them diving for cover. In their confusion, neither noticed the direction the shot had come from. "That'll be the posse," Thomas called out, quick to seize the opportunity she'd created. "Sounds like they've got you surrounded." "Shut up," yelled the scarred outlaw, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Gemma fired again, this time sending a bullet into the ground near the younger outlaw's feet. He yelped and fired wildly into the gathering darkness. "Drop your weapons," she shouted, deepening her voice as best she could. "You're surrounded." The younger outlaw looked ready to comply, but his companion cursed and raised his gun toward Thomas. "If we're going down, so is he." Gemma didn't hesitate. Her third shot caught the scarred outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun discharged into the air as he fell. The younger man immediately threw down his weapon. "Don't shoot, I surrender." Gemma emerged from her hiding place, rifle trained on the young outlaw as she approached. "Hands where I can see them. Now get his gun," she nodded toward the wounded man who was clutching his bleeding shoulder. The young outlaw complied, wide-eyed at being captured by a woman. "You ain't no posse," he said. "No," Gemma agreed, moving to Thomas and using her belt knife to cut his bonds. "I'm the bride." Thomas's face, dirty and bruised from rough handling, broke into a smile that lit his eyes. "You followed their trail alone, Gemma. That was reckless and dangerous, and I wasn't about to let you miss our wedding," she finished for him, helping him to his feet. "Now, can you ride? We should secure these two and meet the posse." With both outlaws disarmed, the wounded one's belt and bandana serving as bindings, they mounted Penny, Thomas behind Gemma with his arms around her waist. The outlaws were forced to walk ahead of them, heading back toward town. They met the posse about an hour into their journey, led by Deputy Wilson, who had insisted on coming despite his injured leg. The look of astonishment on the faces of the townsmen when they saw Gemma, Thomas, and their two captives was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Miss Blackwell," stammered Wilson. "How did you—" "That's a tale for another time," Thomas interrupted, his arm tightening around Gemma's waist. "Right now, I'd appreciate an escort back to town. I have a wedding to attend tomorrow." Dawn broke clear and cool on their wedding day. The church was full, not with the society guests Harold Whitcomb had insisted upon, but with the people of Redemption Springs who had witnessed their unlikely love story unfold. In a simple white dress sewn by her own hand, Gemma stood before the altar once more. But this time, there was no fear of abandonment, no dread of public humiliation. There was only joy and certainty as she faced Thomas, handsome in his best suit despite the bandage on his temple and the bruise on his jaw. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Phillips, his kind face beaming at the couple before him. As the ceremony progressed, Gemma felt unexpected tears well up, not of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming happiness. She tried to blink them away, not wanting anything to mar this perfect moment. Thomas noticed, as he seemed to notice everything about her. Gently, in full view of everyone, he reached out and brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Your tears will be wiped away by me," he whispered, echoing his words from that first day. "Today and always, Gemma." "I love you, Thomas Jarrett," she whispered back as Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration afterward was everything their courtship had been: simple, genuine, and filled with warmth. The townspeople who had once whispered about poor Miss Blackwell now toasted to the health and happiness of the sheriff and his brave bride. As evening fell, they slipped away from the festivities to the house that would now be their home, Thomas's small but comfortable dwelling near the sheriff's office, which they had spent the past weeks preparing together. "Mrs. Jarrett," Thomas said as he carried her over the threshold, his voice husky with emotion. "I still can't believe you're mine." "Believe it," she said, her arms around his neck as he set her gently on her feet. "I think perhaps we were always meant to find each other, though the path was unexpected." "I wouldn't change a moment of it," he said, drawing her close. "Even being kidnapped by outlaws if it meant ending up here with you." Their life together began that night, a partnership of equals, bound by love and mutual respect. The years that followed brought challenges, as all lives do, but also immeasurable joy. Thomas continued as sheriff, his fair and steady leadership helping Redemption Springs grow from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town. Gemma expanded the school, eventually hiring a second teacher as the population increased. Together, they became the heart of the community they both loved. Children came first: a son they named David, after Gemma's father, and then twin girls who had their mother's determination and their father's steady nature. Their home, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, became known as a place of welcome and warmth. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Gemma back to the creek where he had proposed. The October air was crisp, the cottonwoods blazing gold against the blue Arizona sky. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they walked hand in hand along the familiar path. "Marrying the sheriff instead of a businessman like Whitcomb? Your life might have been easier with fine things and less worry." Gemma stopped, turning to face the man whose love had healed her heart and given her a life richer than she could have imagined. "Thomas Jarrett, in 10 years you've asked me some foolish questions, but that may be the most foolish yet." His eyes crinkled with the smile that still made her heart skip. "Is that so?" "That's so," she confirmed, reaching up to touch his face, now weathered by a decade more of desert sun and responsibility. "I have never for one moment regretted choosing us. You promised to wipe away my tears, and you've given me so much joy there have been precious few to wipe." He pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been on the day he'd first held her. "I love you, Gemma Jarrett, more with each passing day. And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My cowboy, my sheriff, my heart." as they kissed beside the creek where their journey together had truly begun. Both knew with absolute certainty that the unexpected path that had led them to each other had been the greatest blessing of their lives. Years later, when their children were grown with families of their own, Thomas and Gemma would still walk hand in hand through Redemption Springs, their love a testament to the healing power of second chances and the unexpected ways that hearts find their true homes. And sometimes, on quiet evenings as they sat on their porch watching the desert sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Gemma would lay her head on Thomas's shoulder and whisper, "Thank you for wiping away my tears." And he would always answer, "Thank you for giving me the chance."